Our speaker will be teaching us about the Mormon Rebellion, America's first Civil War. David Bigler has just had his book published and we'll review it tonight. He won't tell you, but it's the #1 bestseller of the top 10 at the University of Oklahoma Press. And this is within a month of the book being out. David is a former Mormon and has been a Christian for 26 years. When we heard of his book, we jumped at the opportunity for a history lesson on the Mormon federal government confrontation, as well as Western American history.
Thank you, Pete. After an introduction like that, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. Dateline, Sacramento, January 8, 1858. California's newly elected 5th governor blamed Mormons and Indians for the decline in immigration, so important to developing the state's resources. Apparently referring to the massacre at Mountain Meadows, Governor John D. Weller said hundreds had been inhumanly butchered while wending their way over American soil to our shores. He called on the whole power of the federal government to see to it that such bloody scenes are not reenacted again on our great highways. As Governor Weller made clear, President Buchanan, skipped a paragraph here, help was on its way, but delayed in the snow on the high plains of southwestern Wyoming. At Fort Bridger, some 1,800 officers and men of the U.S. Army's Utah expedition prepared to march on Salt Lake City as soon as spring opened the trail through the mountains. Between them and the Mormon stronghold stood the hosts of Latter-day Israel, also known as the Nauvoo Legion, or Utah Militia, as many as 4,000 strong, ready to shed their blood if they tried it. President Buchanan had unwittingly touched off this armed confrontation months before. In May 1857, he had ordered the U.S. Army to unseat Brigham Young as governor and impose federal law in the insubordinate territory. As God is my helper, Young had roared, they cannot come here. He proclaimed martial law and ordered the militia to repel the invaders. He also halted all travel across the territory, then large enough to enclose New England, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. This action virtually cut the nation in half and made bloodshed certain if Young did not back down or move out of the way. The immediate impact of this trails closure had landed squarely on California. As Governor Weller made clear, there was no doubt where his state stood in this military impasse. Even as he spoke, volunteer companies were forming in the mining towns along the Sierra Nevada, ready to invade Utah from the west. They would not have far to go. Utah Territory's border then reached all the way to our present state line and took in Carson Valley and Reno. There was no Nevada then. Now, if my partner Will Bagley and I had started out to write about the Civil War 4 years later, we'd assume that most people, most Americans already knew a lot about that great war and its origin, including slavery. But we looked in vain for honest answers to why our first Civil War came about and how. This required us to add early chapters to our book to explain this. We also share the view of a religion editor who has written that Mormonism, properly titled the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, today produces, quote, some of the most productive, law-abiding, patriotic, and community-minded citizens the country has ever seen. So how could such people have crossed swords with the United States? The larger answer to this question we found in 3 quotes by elected officials of state and federal government. The first, they instituted among themselves the government of their own, independent of and in opposition to the government of this state. Next, the Mormons openly denounced the government of the United States as utterly corrupt and is about to pass away and be replaced by the government of God. And finally, their hostility to the lawful government of the country has at length become so violent that no officer bearing a commission from the chief magistrate of the Union can enter the territory or remain there in safety. Who wrote those words? All were heads of state. Each had sent troops to suppress a perceived Mormon rebellion, and together they used the word government 5 times in 3 sentences to identify the problem. In order of mention, they were Lilburn Boggs, governor of Missouri, Illinois Governor Thomas Ford, and James Buchanan, our 15th governor, our 15th president, As they show, there wasn't just one Mormon war, but 3. The 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, the 1844-1846 Mormon War in Illinois, and the 1857-58 Mormon Rebellion in Utah Territory. What was the government that these elected heads of state and the president, what was the government they referred to as the root cause of 3 Mormon wars within a 20-year period during the 19th century? When the heavens allegedly opened in 1820, and God once again addressed himself to humankind as he had in the days of Moses, he reinstated a form of government known as a theocracy, defined by my 2,600-page, 10-pound, 95-year-old Webster's New English Dictionary of the English language as government of a state by the immediate direction of God, political rule by priests representing the deity. Theocratic rule bestows many blessings. No longer need one bear the anguish of uncertainty and an endless search to discover who he is, why she came to be at this time, and how one can be certain of self-awareness hereafter. Such blessed assurance, however, bears an unwanted corollary. For prior to the millennium, a theocracy ruled by heaven from heaven above cannot coexist with a republic ruled by representatives of its people from earth below, without civil warfare. The 2 governing systems by nature are incompatible and cannot live together in peace. There will be a struggle for supremacy until one compels the other either to bend or be gone. Brigham Young had learned this the hard way by 1847 when he led his people to the place Joseph Smith had chosen before he was murdered in 1844. It was the Great Basin of North America, a vast region from which no water flows to any ocean, then within the Republic of Mexico. This arid and empty region of interior drainage today covers parts of 6 western states, including our own. Here, Young would undertake to fill the dream of the faith's founding prophet, a vaulting vision, inherently hostile to the United States. It was to establish the kingdom of God as a literal political entity, destined to supersede the American Republic and all man-made realms, to prepare for Christ's return to rule the world within the lifetime of believers of that day. You could get an idea what a large vision this was and how motivated these people were to fulfill it. But even Young could not have imagined what happened next. 6 months after he reached Salt Lake Valley, workmen on January 24th, 1848, turned the water into the sawmill John Sutter and James Marshall were building on the South Fork of the American River. That night, Mormon Henry Bigler, a great uncle several times removed, wrote the words in his journal that electrified men around the world. This day, some kind of metal was found in the tail race that looked like gold. Even more fateful was what happened less than 2 weeks later. Mexico ceded to the United States almost our entire Southwest. All were part of today's states of California, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. At a stroke, God's kingdom was right back under Washington's thumb, with its worker bees squatters on the public domain, and the outside world about to come booming across lands belonging to the Lord. At these unwanted events, Mormon leaders created the free and independent state of Deseret. The word Deseret is a synonym for God's kingdom. Fewer than 10,000 settlers staked out a new nation in Western America, about twice the size of Texas, with a seaport at San Diego. Its size revealed Young's vision of expansion as missionaries gathered a rising flood of converts of Israel's children from around the countries around the world. In 1850, Congress created the state of Deseret. In 1850, Congress created the state of Deseret. There, I did it again. In 1850, Congress created the state of California. Repeat that after me. But rejected Deseret. That year it approved a territory with the unwanted name of Utah and trimmed its size. Washington would now send politicians to fill the kingdom's political and judicial offices. Territorial lawmakers, in turn, created and filled duplicating offices. Utah was now ruled by 2 governments at the same time, one democratic and the other theocratic. Brigham Young stood at the head of both. He was governor as named by President Millard Fillmore and governor by the unanimous vote of his followers. Having identified the inherent state of war that exists between the 2 systems, Bagley and I turned to the prior points of conflict that reappeared in the American West. President Buchanan provided a good start with his 1838 report to Congress to justify replacing Brigham Young as governor and sending U.S. troops to escort him to assert federal law in Utah. It includes nearly 60 letters and reports by federal agents and officials over a 6-year period alleging treason, disloyalty, and other offenses. His report, however, oddly fails to mention many other government sources that we uncovered. In Missouri, for example, land ownership was volatile even before the Lord asserted his right. In 1831, he named Jackson County as Zion, and Independence as its county seat, the site of New Jerusalem. The blueprint of Zion City resembled a beehive, with a central square mile of identical lots where worker bees lived, and outside plots for them to harvest for common storage and use. Among other things, the concept violated the land laws and policies of a republic that would sell at bargain prices 2/3 of the public domain during the 19th century. Later, in the Great Basin, Brigham Young laid out an almost exact copy of the still unbuilt Jerusalem, today's Salt Lake City, model for all Mormon towns. Land owned by the Lord would not be bought or sold, but assigned as inheritances to the faithful. It was no wonder that David Bigler, appointed to survey Utah land to prepare them for public sale to all comers, Mormons or otherwise, found life in Utah to be just one thrill after another. The frightened surveyor's reports were among the reasons Buchanan sent troops to impose federal authority in Utah Territory. Meanwhile, if divine land ownership set people's teeth on edge, Mormon beliefs on Indians made their hair stand on end. Under this canon, Indians are a remnant of Jacob. Indians are a remnant of Jacob through the lineage of Manasseh, while Mormons literally descend from Ephraim, Joseph's youngest son. Thus, Indians and Mormons then and today are cousins by blood. My patriarchal blessing given as a young teenager tells me I'm of the blood of Ephraim, literally. All of which seems harmless enough, but there's an explosive side to this doctrine. For in the last days, said the prophet Micah, in words repeated in the Book of Mormon, quote, "The remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles in the midst of many people, a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who, if he go through, both treadeth and teareth in pieces." Now, families that lived in lonely cabins on the Indian frontier could easily see that the young lion meant the Indians, while the sheep referred to them. Our work further shows they had reason to fear. Our first chapters detail other points of dispute between Mormons and their neighbors, including Joseph Smith's use of revelation and public voice voting to create the theocratic city-state of Nauvoo on the Mississippi River, where he ruled all parts of government, including the Nauvoo Legion, a private army. In Utah, lawmakers also outlawed the right to cast a secret ballot. The two were the same. The Illinois city was a working model for the institutions Young set up in the West. For example, Nauvoo's municipal council created an exclusive court system for a people who lived under higher law. Utah lawmakers did the same. To bypass the federal benches, they created a probate court in each county and vested them with original civil and criminal jurisdiction, powers not intended by Congress, to create an exclusive judiciary rewired under Brigham Young. They also outlawed legal precedent and common law. By 1856, it had become clear that God's kingdom in the West could not exist and fulfill its destiny under territorial rule. Its leaders now opened a determined bid for sovereignty through statehood. In those days, the federal government did not pass laws that governed states. States were sovereign entities. But the Republican Party had won control of Congress on a platform to abolish slavery and polygamy. Congress refused even to consider Utah's bid for statehood. Young got the bad news in late August and moved at that point for full independence. 3 weeks later, he touched off a fiery revival to purify Israel and to purify Israel and offer before the Lord a sanctified people worthy of favor in the coming confrontation with the United States. Known as the Reformation, its significance cannot be overstated. We call it the most fearful religious upheaval since the 1642 witchcraft hunt, Salem witch hunt, and devote a full chapter to it. During this emotional upheaval, members underwent interrogation, confession, and rebaptism, after which they would live under God's law. They also had to cleanse their homes and bodies and flush federal officials, apostate, Gentile merchants, and other such corruption out of the body of Latter-day Israel, including the American Bible Society agents, which we just encountered recently as being chased out of the territory at this time. Now ignored or downplayed, the 1856-57 Reformation, with its doctrine of blood atonement, the belief that certain sins are so serious they can only be atoned by the blood of the sinner, brought the struggle between the ruling systems to a head and led to crimes hard to justify or admit. With Washington in an uproar, the nation stood on the brink of civil war, its first civil war. On April 1st, 1857, Utah's top Mormon military officer, Lieutenant General Daniel Wells, reorganized Mormon troops into companies of 10, 50, and 100, like the hosts of ancient Israel, and ordered all able-bodied men to report for duty. No more were they the Utah militia. Now they were the army of God, the host of Latter-day Israel, the Nauvoo Legion, ready to defend the sovereignty of God's kingdom against the United States. As they mobilized, President Buchanan acted. At his direction, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, on May 28, ordered the formation of an expedition of not less than 2,500 men to act as a posse comitatus in aiding a new governor and other federal officials to enforce federal law in the rebellious territory. He instructed its first commander, 2nd Dragoons Colonel William Harney, not to attack any body of citizens except in sheer defense. Buchanan's order landed on a U.S. Army already overstretched by Congress's failure to increase its size in keeping with national expansion from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to the acquisition of the Southwest mentioned earlier in 1848. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. Army never fielded over 7,000 or 8,000 men to police a frontier of 2 million square miles, according to the noted historian Robert Upton. Offsetting the lack of numbers, however, was the quality of its West Point trained officers. It was also dangerously late in the season to mobilize and equip troops from widely scattered locations at Fort Leavenworth and supply them for a 1,000-mile march across an uninhabited region. Not until mid-July did Company of the 10th Infantry become the first to march west on the Oregon Trail. No one expected opposition, as other units were outfitted and headed west from the Missouri River coast. Meanwhile, Colonel Harney and his 2nd Dragoon companies were detached for service in Bleeding, Kansas, the border war there. Harney was replaced by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, commander of the crack 2nd U.S. Cavalry, who left his regiment in Texas in the capable hands of his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. As the Army labored to overcome snafus at every level, Captain Stuart Van Fleet arrived at Salt Lake to see Brigham Young about a site and supplies for the oncoming expedition. While he was there, Brigham Young refused any help and told him that the Army would not be allowed to enter the city. And while he was there, an express also arrived with a message for Brigham Young from Nauvoo Legion commander at Cedar City, 250 miles to the south. It said, the Indians had corralled the immigrant train at Mountain Meadows and asked what to do. Young did not show Van Fleet the note or his reply, which was in effect, do not interfere with the immigrants. Indians will do as they please, but keep them on our side. Even this odd note arrived too late. Our new book presents a full chapter on the massacre of the California-bound train from Arkansas, referred to by Governor Weller, giving the latest evidence on the nation's most horrific massacre or mass murder. And we say that because of the way that it was done. There were more killed on September 11th in New York City, but the way it was done on Mountain Meadows was up close and personal with firearms, rifles, hatchets, and knives, clubs on children. There were nearly 20 children over the ages of 17 who were killed. Over the age of 7 who were killed. Only 7 children under 8 were spared. It was also mid-September before the 2nd Dragoons under Colonel Philip St. George Cook marched west with Alfred Cumming, Young's replacement as governor, and other federal officials. The Army now stretched 1,000 miles from Fort Leavenworth to western Wyoming, with its infantry in front and supply trains and cavalry at the rear. But this backwards marching order didn't matter much because a territory of 40,000 people would never attack a nation of over 30 million, or so everyone thought. All except the red-bearded Mormon officer who eyed from a nearby hill the supply wagon lined up on Green River in Wyoming. As soon as it got dark, Major Lot Smith and his mounted company struck. When the supply train captain said, "For God's sake, don't burn the wagons," Smith said, "It's for his sake I'm going to burn them." And he did so. In less than 24 hours, he and his men burned enough supplies to feed the army for 2 months. Given unexpected Mormon resistance, an army expedition too hastily called and planned now faced survival as falling temperatures warned of early winter. Abandoning hope to reach Salt Lake, Colonel Johnston moved to concentrate his army and gain the shelter of Fort Bridger as a great cold front swept the high plain from the north. It took 12 days to travel the last 30 miles, not one to overstate. Johnston said that they reached Fort Bridger on November 18, literally with their last step forward. But they left 3,000 horses, mules, and cattle dead on the trail. To provide badly needed cavalry support, Colonel Philip St. George Cook drove his 6th Dragoon Company over the Continental Divide at South Pass into the teeth of the deadly blizzard to gain Fort Bridger the next day. The horse soldiers at last were up, but alas, many now on foot, having lost 134 horses, or about half the number they started out with, in their determination to stop raids on the expedition's supply line. It was one of many heroic stories told in our book. Another came right after that one. Stuck at Fort Bridger, Johnston acted at once to survive the winter and prepare to attack in the spring. He had given orders to fire on any Mormon mounted companies that were armed Mormon companies that his troops might encounter. The nearest source of supply for the nearest source for the animals he needed to accomplish both aims was Fort Union in New Mexico. But a direct line to the post on the Santa Fe Trail would take crossing the heart of the Rocky Mountains at Cochitopa Pass in midwinter, an impossible feat, it was considered. Even so, 5th Infantry Captain Randolph B. Marcy and 40 stout-hearted enlisted men volunteered to do it. On the Continental Divide, they crawled on all fours to break trail in deep snow as they searched for the path. At the foot of the mountain on the other side, they lay too starved and spent to move as one of their Mexican packers pushed ahead 60 miles to Fort Massachusetts, now in Colorado, for help. In one of the most heroic feats of Western history, they lost only one man, but that a very good one, who died from exposure and overeating after supper arrived. They returned in the spring, however, with 160 horses, 800 mules, and a battalion of mounted riflemen from Fort Union. Less productive was the venturesome civilian Johnston authorized to lead a small party north to buy cattle from mountaineers wintering on the headwaters of the Missouri River, now in Montana. Finding the wilderness denizens too afraid of the Mormons to drive their animals to Fort Bridger, Benjamin Franklin Ficklin did the next best thing. He incited the Indians to attack the herd at Fort Limhi, a Mormon settlement on Salmon River, now in southern Idaho. He incited the Bannocks to attack. The Bannocks killed 2 missionaries, kept the cattle themselves, and slammed the door on Mormon last resort plans to move north which led to a heroic feat on their side. With 67 frightened men, women, and children under siege at Fort Limhi, Ezra Barnard and Baldwin Watt, with the feet of their horses carefully wrapped in cloth to deaden the sound, slipped through the Indian camps at night and rode or walked through the snow nearly 400 miles to the nearest settlement. They made it, but just barely. The news they bore was devastating. Gone was Brigham Young's fallback plan to move north in the event the kingdom failed to prevail in its bid for independence, which depended on the active support of some of the Western America's most powerful tribes, and their attack on Fort Limhi had shown they could not be relied on. Young got the fateful news on March 8, 1858. The next day he swallowed his pride and sent word to Colonel Johnston that he had learned his troops were very destitute of provisions. He proposed to send 250 head of cattle and 20,000 pounds of flour to the hungry army at Fort Bridger. Johnston rejected the offer, but Young's successor as governor saw it as a peace offering. But time for Young to say uncle, as in Uncle Sam, was running out. By then, Winfield Scott had sent the 1st Cavalry, 6th and 7th Infantry, artillery units, and other commands to more than triple the size of Johnston's army and ready it for a frontal assault on Mormon defenses in Echo Canyon. Luckily for Brigham Young, spring also found President Buchanan in a mood to avoid bloodshed if possible. On April 6, 1858, he offered to all inhabitants, quote, who shall submit to the laws, a free pardon for seditions and treasons heretofore by them committed. He said in his offer, the land you live upon was purchased by the United States and paid for out of their treasure. The right and title to it is in them and not in you. He continued, it's absurd to believe that they will or can permit you to erect in their very midst a government of your own. This rebellion, he said, is not merely a violation of your legal duty. It is without just cause, without reason, without excuse. At the same time, he warned, there would be no further leniency offered. To deliver this ultimatum, Buchanan selected Lazarus W. Powell, Secretary of Powell, former governor of Kentucky, and the celebrated Texas Ranger Captain Ben McCulloch. Secretary of War John D. Floyd told the pair that their purpose was to convince the people of Utah that it was in their interest to submit promptly and peaceably to the Constitution and laws of the United States. They were not authorized to negotiate, bargain, or enter into any agreement or treaty, whatever, Floyd made clear. On June 11, Buchanan's agents met with Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders who started a windy rehearsal of grievances from the founding of the faith to that day. This was their forte to cry persecution. And so they started a long delay giving the story of how they had suffered wherever they were. As they talked, however, Colonel Johnson let them know that it was time to take the pardon for the consequences. Now reinforced and made mobile by 800 mules, he advanced toward the Bear River crossing, ready to assault Mormon defenses in Echo Canyon. At this move, Young backed squarely down. When the news arrived at Johnston's camp, one of the most motivated armies in the history of the Republic became one of the most disappointed. They wanted to make Brigham Young and his people suffer for 7 weeks in the snow at Fort Bridger on short rations, and were deprived of that opportunity. Bagley and I stressed Young's unqualified surrender because Utah historians typically misrepresent what happened at the meeting, claiming the parties agreed that the president had been misinformed and his decision to order troops to Utah was Buchanan's blunder. We present the evidence that removes any doubt that our 15th president correctly understood the problem and took the right action to address it. Time has proved it beneficial and permanent for both parties. 2 weeks later, Johnston halted his army at the mouth of Emigration Canyon. As his army marched through Utah's capital, he ordered, "Keep ranks closed, eyes forward, and mouths shut." In a bid for public sympathy, the residents of Salt Lake and northern settlements had been ordered to move south to Provo and beyond. The only occupants of the city were determined-looking men ready to burn the city to the ground if the army tried to occupy it and live there. The troops marched through as ordered in a highly disciplined column that reached at least 10 miles. When its head reached camp west of the Jordan River, the New York Times reporter looked back and saw the glistening bayonets and snowy wagon covers still defiling from the mountains. Johnston established a new post at Fairview in Utah Valley on the west side of Utah Lake opposite Provo, naming it Camp Floyd after the Secretary of War. Brigham Young never intended to honor his pledge to obey federal law, while his timid successor feared bloodshed if he called on the army to enforce it. So life went on as before. Young was governor in fact, and his replacement was governor in name. It was as if Buchanan had never sent the army to Utah in the first place. With little to do, troops were drawn down even before April 1861, when Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor. In so doing, they sounded the start of the Civil War and the last days of Camp Floyd. The Army sold its leftover equipment and supplies, but it burned the ammunition rather than sell any to Young or his agents, which angered the Mormon leaders. He did claim the Camp Floyd flag as a token, however, of his victory over the United States. But the war was not over yet, and his satisfaction was short-lived, which just takes us back to California. At the start of the Civil War, President Lincoln called on California for troops to stop a Confederate invasion of the Southwest from Texas. With the nation divided between North and South, where do you suppose Lincoln might order troops to keep it united between the East and West? He knew that Brigham Young had cut overland lines of communication and travel in 1857. He could not afford or tolerate a repeat performance. So, if you guessed Salt Lake City, you'd have it right, for it came to pass that in 1862, more American troops arrived. They were the 3rd California Volunteer Infantry, recruited from the mining towns east of Stockton by its colonel, Irish Catholic immigrant Patrick E. Connor, who had won the notice of Zachary Taylor in the Battle of Buena Vista during the war with Mexico. The regiment chaplain was John A. Anderson, former minister of Stockton's Presbyterian Church and reporter for the San Francisco Daily Bulletin. Thanks to him, we have a splendid report of the Army's entry to Salt Lake City. 2 miles from the Capitol, Connor formed his line of march. The mounted color guard, with U.S. and California flags in front, followed by the colonel and his staff. Then came infantry, cavalry, artillery, other units, commissary wagons, and rear guard, with infantry and cavalry bands between the units. With bands playing and flags snapping in the wind, the column, some 750 strong, marched right up Main Street. Quote, every crossing was occupied by spectators, and windows, doors, and roofs had their gazers, Anderson reported. But not a cheer nor a jeer greeted us. He saw none of the manifestations of loyalty that any other city in a loyal territory would have made. As it neared Temple Square, the column turned right and marched 3 or 4 miles onto the bench east of the city. There, Connor located Fort Douglas. They were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1 by the Mormon military. But their guns on the high ground overlooking the city served notice that there would be no repetition of Brigham Young's trail closure unless he wanted to take on the whole state of California, not to mention the United States. As the nation emerged from the Great Civil War, stronger than ever, its longest struggle between church and state continued in courts, legislative halls, and political arenas. National lawmakers used polygamy as a wrecking ball to destroy the theocratic political system that existed, while Mormon leaders fought every way they could to save the marriage practice. So when did the Mormon rebellion end? Some say it ended when Brigham Young occupied when Brigham Young accepted Buchanan's offer of his pardon. Others will say it ended in 1890 when the 4th president of the LDS Church announced that he would obey the nation's laws, including those against polygamy. Will Bagley and I think it ended with the death of Brigham Young in 1877. It was always his war, and he waged it from the day Joseph Smith, the faith's first prophet, was murdered in Carthage, Illinois, in the jail there. We also believe there is much we can learn from this teapot struggle between democracy and theocracy as our nation faces similar challenges in the world today. But to benefit from them, history cannot be a counterfeit rendition that encourages complacency and false pride. It must know and respect the motives of the men and women on all sides who lived it. And it must be as fair and as balanced, and above all as honest and factual as admittedly flawed historians can make it. At this critical time in our history, there can be no purpose that justifies any exception to this rigorous and righteous standard. And that is my prayer tonight, and I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. As I thank each of you for coming here tonight. Yeah, I did.
David will take some questions now. If any of you have anything you'd like to know. I have one, and that is, where did all the Mormons come from, Dave? How did they get there?
Well, all the Mormons in Utah during this time included two groups. One of them would be the Mormons that were left over from wars in Missouri and Illinois and had not left the faith but stuck with it. They were the veterans of old line. And then the others were from overseas, mainly from Great Britain and the Scandinavian countries. Some of them in 1856 came in handcarts. This was the poor people from England mainly. Handcart companies. There were more than 1,200 people who started out this way. And how they would come is they would load their few possessions. They would come to Iowa City, build their own handcart, and then haul them 1,000 miles to Salt Lake Valley with their few belongings and back. Two companies started too late through bad management, were caught in the winter, and over 200 people perished. This is another of the great unknown stories in Mormon history.
Dave, if I remember correctly, Dave, the part in the book that talked about where Brigham Young issued the dictum that said there will be no business dealings with the Gentiles, but yet there was an army, and the army requires uniforms and weapons and supplies. How could they possibly get all of that if there were, if I remember correctly, if there were no dealings with the Gentiles?
Well, of course, Brigham Young can make the rules as he went along, being the prophet. And that's one of the benefits of the theocratic system of government. So they did meet with the emissaries, the representatives of Buchanan sent. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I was referring to the fact that he said you cannot deal business dealings with any of the Gentiles. The whole business dealings need to be within the compound.
Oh, yes.
But yet they had to buy all this stuff someplace, and I don't know if they were able to build all the rifles and all the weapons and all the rounds that go with those, or whether they had to buy them outside.
They were determined to become self-sufficient. The idea of the square mile with the city in the center and people living lots in the city and having plots assigned to them on the outskirts is a communitarian, it's a communistic idea. You'd live in the city, the hive, and go out and gather the food in the farm plot assigned to you and bring it to a common storage area for use by everybody by you and others as they needed it. Now, true enough, this allows no room for outsiders. Mormonism in this period did not allow room for more outsiders, wherever they were. They were extremely exclusive. And this concept violated federal land laws. It was also threatening the Mormon neighbors, this exclusive nature. If you were a lone farmer and you had a family, and your own claim of 160 acres, and you're trying to survive, and you have this organized operation going on next to you, it places you at a huge disadvantage. And so that caused resentment with neighbors. I may not have gotten to the heart of your question, but there was probably more contact than the book gives the impression, perhaps, that there were. For example, the gold rush made it really helped Mormons survive in Utah because the gold rushers coming through needed fresh vegetables, food. They needed to trade for fresh animals, stronger animals, and they provided a source of income during this period. But when Young, in 1856, started the Reformation, and then when he closed the trail and the borders of Utah Territory, bear in mind that territory reached from our present California line all the way to the Rocky Mountains of central Colorado. It was a huge area, and it lay right across America's lines of travel and communication between the eastern and western seaboard. When he closed that vast area, he meant it to be closed with no Gentiles allowed. And that may be the point. This is the point, in other words, where he took his stand, where the kingdom of God took its stand to be a sovereign, independent state without outsiders following.
I have a question. I understand that you are a former Mormon.
Yes.
Could you share your story with us? Maybe how you were able to, how your journey, how you were able to leave Mormonism and become a Christian?
I enlisted, I'll try to make it as brief as possible. I enlisted in the Navy at age 17 during World War II and was sent to Chicago, Great Lakes Training Center. And there the people of Chicago at that time invited young service people, men, to come to their homes for dinner and to mingle with young people their own age and so on. And so this family invited me, and they were very nice. We had dinner, and we were sitting around the fire with this group of young people, and I think they were Catholic people, youngsters. And they found out then that I was a Mormon, and they asked me what Mormons believed. And I'd always assumed, that I'd been drilled in it my life. And as I started to tell them the story about how Joseph Smith went in the woods to ask, which church to join, and two figures came down in shiny white suits, and as I was telling them this story, I could see from the expression on their faces. To me, it was the most believable thing in the world. I could see by the expression on their faces that they didn't really believe that. And they couldn't figure out how I could believe it. And I thought to myself, that really does sound pretty far out. So I never really took it seriously after that. And I never went on a mission. My father told me if I didn't go on a mission, I would fail at everything I did. And when a father tells you that, it's very motivational. It can either discourage you or it gives you an I'll show him spirit. So I went into the steel industry, and I had a very successful steel industry career. I got to be a director of public affairs for the nation's largest steel company. But I wasn't satisfied with myself. I wasn't satisfied with how I was, habits that I had, and things that I wanted to change and couldn't. And I was pretty unhappy about that all the time. I was aware of it. Then the young fellow who had worked for me before called me from Gary, Indiana, to congratulate me on my new job. And he'd been one of these, gung-ho Christians, trying to convert everybody. And he apparently read something in my voice that indicated I used to make fun of him, but he detected in something in my manner that indicated I may be interested. And the next thing I knew, the next day, a man came from the Pittsburgh Experiment to invite me to attend the Thank God It's Friday meeting at the Presbyterian Church. And the Presbyterian Experiment was a drive campaign to Christianize an entire city. And the Thank God It's Friday at luncheon brought people from bank presidents, secretaries, people from all faiths out of the building to this one service. where a great evangelist, John Guest, spoke. And it wasn't long before I knew what I needed to do and what the answer was. And so I accepted Jesus Christ, got on my knees and asked him to come into my life, take charge, and because I had not done well, I wanted him to do it. Take charge of the operation from then on. And the next morning, the habits that I had just vanished, didn't exist. We joined a Presbyterian church because my grandmother in Utah had learned how to read and write from Presbyterian missionaries that had gone to Utah to convert Mormon, like they were going to some other part of the world. And they opened schools and taught Mormon children how to read and write on the assumption that someday this would prepare them to understand why they should not stay in Mormonism. What it did was, it liberalized them all right, but they stayed with most of them, or many of them, within Mormonism, and began the evolution of Mormonism to the faith it is today. And so that was, I guess, some improvement. Well, that's my story. It took too long to tell it.
Thank you for that. Praise God. My question is, has the Mormon Church officially taken responsibility for the tragedy of Mountain Meadows?
The Mormon Church started out saying only the Indians did it. And then from there, under increasing fire and pressure from the country, they allowed us how Robert E. Lee had led the Indians. And then he was Brigham Young's adopted son under a religious ordinance. And the Indian farmer there. And then it was Robert E. Lee and a few renegade Mormons that did it. And the pressure has been building. I was a founder, one of the three incorporators of the Mountain Meadows Association in about 1982 or 3. And since then it's been very active, and it includes all the descendants of the people who were killed and their relatives today. And they and others have brought pressure on the church. And the church has been governed by some very fine men. As a matter of fact, some of the best men I've known have been leaders of the church. And the president of the church became involved and felt this needed, something had to be done to acknowledge Mormon involvement in it, instead of this business of trying to tell false stories. And that began the change, so that in 2001, I guess it was, or two, a general authority of the Mormon Church attended the anniversary of the massacre at Cedar City, and I was there, and he acknowledged that the people who killed the immigrants were the Mormon militia company, Mormons of that town, with a few Indians, but it had been primarily Mormon. Now bear in mind, these are essentially God-fearing good men, family men, who felt that one of them said, according to a report, as he shot a wounded immigrant, he said, "Oh Lord, take their soul. I have done this. I've done this for the sake of the kingdom of God," or something along like that. So they were zealots, and there was a strain of zealotry and fanaticism in Mormons at that time, many of them, that does not exist today. And Cedar City was kind of a hotbed of it. Now, if you ask me what I think, no, I can't prove anything. There's no smoking gun evidence that the Brigham Young ordered this massacre, the attack on the train. So I can't prove anything. My own opinion on the basis of circumstantial evidence, much of which is now in this book for the first time. I think on the basis of that circumstantial evidence, I believe that it was ordered. Whether they intended he intended for all those people to be killed or not, I don't know. But the order came from Salt Lake, and that came from Brigham Young.
How was he killed? How was Joseph Smith killed? And what's the best way for witness to know his God's life? Those elders that are only 18.
Yeah. Well, they, of course, don't hear what you heard tonight. They have no idea.
Repeat my question, please. The first question was, how was he killed? How was Joseph Smith killed?
Oh.
And second question was, what's the best way to witness to those young kids?
At Nauvoo, Illinois, a group of Mormons, actual Mormons, a dissenting group, did not like the things he was doing. It was Smith who introduced the kingdom of God ideas in the earthly state. And it was Smith who came up with a lot of these radical aspects of Mormonism that are not recognized today. He instituted polygamy, for example. There were many who didn't like that. So they formed their own organization and issued a newspaper. And it was called the Nauvoo Expositor, to expose what was being done at Nauvoo. And Joseph Smith, being mayor, he was he ran everything. He ordered the newspaper destroyed. This caused a big uproar, and Joseph Smith and his brother and several other Mormon leaders were arrested and taken to Carthage, Illinois, and held in their jail on the second floor. A unit of the county militia men who painted their faces black and disguised themselves broke into the jail and shot Joseph Smith and his brother and wounded several of the Mormon leaders. That's where he was killed.
Would you have any way of tracking the identity of your buyers of your book, such as, are they mainly Mormons, professed Mormons, or are they professed Christians, or are they mixed? Or have you even been able to do anything like that? It would be interesting to know.
You mean whether they're Christians or not?
Christians or Mormons, or a combination.
Is there a separation, are you saying? Are Mormons Christians?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I always thought Mormons were Christians as well as Christians, but there seems to be, from what I hear, and certainly I could be wrong on this, but it would be interesting to me to know if they're professed Mormons or professed Christians, not Mormons or regular.
Yeah.
So do you understand what I'm saying? I hope you do.
It's a little hard to tell. It is especially hard from the young fellows who come around, because they're not going to tell you the hard stuff right off the bat.
Dave?
But
Dave, I think she asked you about the buyers of the book.
Oh, the buyers of the book?
Yeah, those are people who purchased the book.
Well, I tell you, first off, the publisher, Oklahoma University Press, is one of the premier publishers of non-fiction in the United States. So it's an important publisher. And within 4 weeks after our book came out, our book was #1 of their 10 best-selling books. So it sells. And what that tells me is that a lot of Mormons are interested in this history.
So you do think primarily the buyers of your book are identified as Mormons?
I don't know how they identified in the purchase, but I believe, because most people don't know what that means, the Mormon Rebellion, 1857.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Have you ever heard of that before?
Yeah, it was my
Okay.
question. Exactly.
Well, see, to a Mormon, that would ring a bell, right?
If I were a Mormon.
They wouldn't know a whole lot more than you do about it, but the word Mormon would be in the title, and the word rebellion would be in the title, and they'd want to know what that was all about. What apostate is out to get them now?
I'm glad I raised the question.
So I don't know how to tell the difference. I don't. But I'm sure the Mormons will be one of our biggest audiences. I believe, and this is opinion only, most Mormons don't really believe a lot of the stuff that the church teaches. But it's a culture. Mormon culture, Mormonism, Mormons are a culture. And they're not like other Christians at all. There's a kind of exclusiveness about them that makes it difficult for them to break out of this culture and begin something new. I know, we know from personal experience what a change it is to become Christian. It's a big change.
Dave?
Yeah.
You talked a lot about an amazing transformation of direction and vision from Young. And when he died, some things happened in the church where the stories started changing, because I think it was, the way you presented it was very clear. It seems to me that the Mormons knew they were trying to start a theocracy. But that did it get lost, or what caused all the change? Because you said by the time he died in 1877, things in the church started to change.
That's when things started to change, but it was changed too slow over a period of time. And this is important to understand. In 1890, the fourth Mormon president, Wilford Woodruff, issued what was called a manifesto. And Mormons today, and other people who've heard of it at all, think that it was strictly to declare that there would be no more polygamy. We're ruling that out. If you read his words, however, his words said our country has passed laws that affect us. Congress passed laws that relate to us, including our marriage practice of polygamy. And I have decided that, for me, I'm going to obey the country's laws from this day forward. Now, theocracy is God's law, and federal law is this way. He said, no longer this way, it'll be all this way from now on. Now, Mormons still think the prophet receives revelation, but it's not like it used to be. And, for example, if the Mormon president came out and said, now I want you all to vote for so-and-so for president, everybody kind of laugh up their sleeve and vote for who they want. That would not have happened in Joseph Smith or Brigham Young's day. For 25 years, the election law in Utah Territory said the voter will hand his ballot to the election judge, who shall write, and on it, you shall write on the slip the names of those he's voting for. He'll hand it to the judge of the election, who will write a number on it, and then hand it to his clerk, who will write in his book the name of the voter and the number opposite. So there's no such thing as a secret ballot for a quarter century. That's theocratic. When after Wilford Woodruff And now they broke into political parties and started doing things differently. So that I would say Brigham Young was probably the pioneer of the father of pioneering, you call. And Wilford Woodruff, who doesn't get enough credit, initiated that period of liberalization where now the theocratic side was going to go. And it's gone now. So that if Mitt Romney runs for president, you can vote for him without fear, in my opinion, while my wife will disagree with me on that.
Dave?
Without fear that he will take orders from Salt Lake.
Dave, what kind of a man was Brigham Young? I read the book, and I was just amazed how he came to conclusions in his actions and what he allowed.
Brigham Young only received one vision. Let's go back. Joseph Smith received revelation on about everything. The revelation would say, I God, to you, Joseph, my son, I want you to go over to Jefferson County and see so-and-so about a wagon. You know, he could give, this was real, active, continuing revelation and direction that talked about people by name, told you where to send them, and what kind of all these things to do. Brigham Young never claimed to be a prophet like that. In fact, at one point when he knew the army was coming, he had one service where he said, now, everybody remember, I told you I'm not a prophet like Joseph Smith was. I'm a prophet, seer, and revelator ordained by the church, but I'm not like that. So he never professed to get personal, this kind of personal thing where you get the picture of two men on opposite sides of the table negotiating. You know, what are we going to do next, Lord? Kind of stuff. So that today, a believing Mormon, if the church president calls him to do something, he does it. But he doesn't have his membership or anything like that. He does it out of faith and consideration for the office. May not answer that question very well, but the process really began to move in the liberal tradition. Ability was Wilford Woodruff in 1890. And your question was, what kind of man was Brigham Young?
Yes, he did things, like you said, he was his own man. I don't think he asked anybody else before he made a decision.
He had 11 and a half days of education in his classroom. So he was not the most literate man in the world. He was a true believer in Joseph Smith and in his calling. And true believers, you know, I drew up a list of 10 lessons that I have learned from the Mormon War. And one of them was, let's see, which number was it? Those who believe in direct rule by God through mullahs, prophets, or holy men cannot be reasoned with. They do not learn from history or experience. Theocratic and ideologues of every stripe cannot be relied on to tell the truth or respect man-made laws, covenants, or codes of conduct. They seek only to exploit them. You can't depend on what they say, because what they say is for the Lord, and it's at an end that justifies the means. He was that kind of believer. When Brigham Young was killed, when Joseph Smith was killed, Brigham Young believed that he had died in order to seal his calling by his blood. And his calling was to establish God's kingdom as a literal entity, political entity, in this continent, and that would grow so rapidly, and it would be this literally the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy as to the stone of Daniel. Stone cut from a mountain without hands, it would roll forth and knock over, destroy all human man-made forms of government. And he believed that the church was that. And he believed it would happen within his lifetime. So he was a very dogmatic man. He had little concern for human. It's a strong thing to say, but some episodes make you think that. When he would visit Manti, where my great uncle lived, he was very kind to him because he suffered from seizures and nobody cared about him there. But Brigham Young was very, very kind to him, would always ask to see him and console him, give him counsel, which I put on one side of the scale. On the other hand, when he needed to get people, when he needed population to maintain this independent sovereign position, he needed more people from overseas in Congress. And they came up with this idea of the handcart. This was a bad idea of moving people. And he did not show, while he was strong in mounting rescue operations, he still did not show a sense of concern about that. They were people, and his job was to build the kingdom of God, and that justified everything else. He was that kind of person.